Hello once again, everybody. Welcome back. Day 3, video 3. I'm an expert. This is a short one. This is really not a lecture at all. This is just the film. I required you to watch this movie on Canopy this week called the Pruitt Igoe Myth, and hopefully you've seen this movie already. If you haven't, please do. It is in parts hard to watch, but it is edifying and enlightening, and it also reflects very closely a number of themes in the class. In fact, it ties together for us many, if not most, of the central themes of the class in one coherent narrative about the fate of the public housing projects in St. Louis in the 1970s. So you've seen the film, or at least I hope you have, and so I'm not going to spend too much time right now summarizing the movie. I'll do that briefly, but then I want to talk about the reasons that Pruitt Igoe, quote-unquote, failed. So the movie tells the story of, and it really parallels everything we've been talking about in this class, it tells the story of the city. And so St. Louis, the city in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. St. Louis is, in this case, a symbol. It's a representative case of what happened to our working cities in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century. And so you see the first half of the 20th century, you see this population boom in St. Louis, and you see folks coming in large numbers out of rural America, black folks from the South, from the post-Reconstruction South, moving into St. Louis, moving into center cities, moving into slums, looking for work. And you see the population growth of St. Louis during the first half of the 20th century. And then the construction of the Pruitt and Igoe public housing towers in the 1950s. And these were built to be an alternative to the slums. They were built with the very best of intentions. As Bernie Sanders said to Joe Biden the other night in the debate, their heart was in the right place. But it didn't work. Pruitt and Igoe didn't work. Public housing high-rises basically didn't work. And so then the question becomes why? What happened? So these are the sort of main reasons for the failure of Pruitt and Igoe. So planners and architects in the middle of the 20th century, they're looking at the slums in places like inner city St. Louis. And these are crowded, dilapidated, old private housing. And you know, if you thought coronavirus was spreading quickly around the world, you should have seen the influenza epidemic of I don't even know when that was. It was probably 1930s. I don't know, but it was around there. But because you had people so crowded in together in inner cities, in these incredibly unhealthy tenement buildings, these slums, viruses just spread very, very quickly. And so the city, so remember urban renewal. this thing that Jane Jacobs was railing against. Urban renewal was this high modern, scientific, science-driven, expertise-driven effort to sanitize our cities. And there is probably no better example of the ideology and the practice of urban renewal at work than public housing high-rises. So Pruitt and Igoe are emblematic of urban renewal efforts in the middle of the 20th century. And so the city thought, because this is important too. The city of St. Louis had federal money that the U.S. federal government gave the money to St. Louis to build these public housing projects. So the city of St. Louis, in sort of a very myopic way, looked at that and said to themselves, that's a freebie. It's a no-brainer. We're going to get this money for free. We're going to build these high-rises. We're going to get these poor families out of the slums where they're being exploited, where life is dangerous and unhealthy and unsanitary, and we're going to put them in these beautiful high-rises, the poor man's penthouse, as they say in the film. So this was really done with the best of intentions, but what happened was the money to build Pruitt and Igoe came from the feds, but the city of St. Louis had to come up with the money to maintain Pruitt and Igoe. And so what they did, so that it would be no cost to them, was they planned it so that all of the maintenance money for Pruitt and Igoe would come out of the rent that residents paid. And that worked in the very beginning. Except that what happened was the city of St. Louis, like the rest of our working cities across the Midwest and the East Coast, the population didn't continue to grow. As they explain in the film, they thought there was going to be an upward trajectory of population growth throughout the 20th century, and what happened was population peaked in the middle of the 20th century, and then it began to decline. Why did it begin to decline? Well, let's go back to the lecture before last. It began to decline because of the Federal Housing Authority, because of the Federal Highway Act, because of Euclidean zoning, in short, because of the advent of the suburbs, because of the proliferation of the automobile. And so people could get out of the city, and they did in droves, moved out of the city into inner ring suburbs. But they're close to the city, but they're not into the city. They're not in the city, at least not in the city proper, which means they're not paying taxes to the city, which means the tax base of the city is eroding, right? And so as middle class and upper middle class white folks move out of the city into inner ring suburbs, the housing stock in the city begins to become less expensive because there's much less demand for it. And as the housing stock becomes less expensive because there's much less demand for it, families start moving out of Pruitt and Igoe. Almost as soon as they all moved in, families start moving out. And now you've got a situation where you have this really complex structure that requires a lot of investment in maintenance, but you have relatively few families living there paying rent, and you can only maintain the structure with the money that you get from the rent. And so as families move out, there's less and less rent to be had. There's less and less money for maintenance of the structures, and so the structures begin to deteriorate. And as the structures deteriorate, the people living in the structures, that social organization that William Julius Wilson talked about, that participation in voluntary activities, that the social capital, the bonds with neighbors, all of that begins to deteriorate, and then that deviant behavior begins to emerge in larger quantities and more intensely. So that's the story. So it's a story of spatial inequality. It's a story of racial segregation. It's a story of the sprawl, the growth of the sprawl. It's a story of the proliferation of the automobile. It's a story of the role of the city in producing the public good. It's the story of expertise and the failure of expertise, the hubris of expertise. There's a lot going on. Maybe you want to go watch it again. Make some popcorn this time. I mean, it isn't like you have anywhere to go. You know what I'm saying? So that's the recap of the story, the reasons why Pruitt Igoe failed. And so this is literally a 2-slide presentation here. But the title of the film is the Pruitt Igoe Myth. And so what I want to ask here and then answer is, why did they choose to call the film the Pruitt Igoe Myth? I think there are kind of 2 ways that you can interpret this. The first one is the idea, they're suggesting that it is a myth that public housing was originally developed in an effort to be punitive, right? Because when we, from our vantage point in 2020, look back at things, and you all probably have never had the occasion to even hear of, much less see or live in Chicago, for example, the Robert Taylor homes, or Cabrini Green, or any of these well-known public housing projects that have been demolished. They were demolished in the early 2000s. In Bloomington, Illinois, we still have public housing high-rises. They're not quite as tall as Cabrini Green was, called Wood Towers on Wood and Main Street. But they are almost exclusively for senior citizens and disabled folks. I digress. Where was I? So when we look from our vantage point in 2020 at the failure of public housing, we think of public housing as originally intended to be a cynical, mean-spirited effort to sequester poor black families in shitty, isolated places. We see it in retrospect as being fundamentally exploitative. But one of the myths that I think this film is trying to burst is that idea. And so, although it didn't work out particularly well because, again, of the hubris of expertise, because of the, to use a more contemporary parlance, the lack of cultural competency of the planners and the experts of the mid-20th century. But the intention was good. The intention was really good. The intention was, you know, the taxpayers, the city government, our goal is to produce public goods. Our goal is to act in the public interest, and it is in the interest of everybody for poor families to have decent, humane, dignified places to live. It's in the public interest, and these slums are not that. They're not dignified, they're not decent, they're not humane, they're exploitative. So we're going to tear down the slums, and we're going to build something that the government will pay for and the government will manage, because the government, unlike the private sector, unlike slumlords, the government has the public's best interests in mind, and the government will act on behalf of marginalized groups that otherwise don't have anybody to act on their behalf. So the intention was good, and I think that is a myth that the film serves to unveil. The second way that we can interpret the title, and this might be the more obvious interpretation, is that it's called the Pruitt Igoe Myth because the myth is that the projects failed because of the people that lived there. So it is a very common argument. You'll hear this often in right-wing news media if you listen to Fox News or something like that, you'll hear this kind of argument. Often it's what we call in sociology a culture of poverty argument. And the argument goes something like this. Look, poor people are poor because they want to be. This is America. Bootstraps. Upward social mobility. All you have to have is some smarts and a work ethic and the willingness to be frugal, and you can get ahead. You work hard, study, go to school, save, get a good job, squirrel away some money for your offspring, and you can move from poverty class to riches over the course of 1 or 2 generations, right? I mean, that's the American myth, the myth of meritocracy. And so we can extend that idea of meritocracy to this explaining, and this is problematic, I think it's erroneous, and I think and that's what the film is suggesting as well, explaining the failure of public housing by saying, look, the reason why public housing failed was because there was some moral deficiency on the part of the people that lived there, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how poor you are or how shitty the elevators are in your building. Like taking a piss in the elevator, there's no excuse for that. Throwing a bottle at a police car, there's no excuse for that. And so you get what you deserve, right? You fucked it up. You acted like animals, so your buildings got torn down, right? That's a culture of poverty argument. It's an argument that blames the victim. It's a problematic argument, but it's an argument we hear a lot. It is on some sort of visceral level, it's intuitive. It resonates with certain people. And so it's an argument that's very commonly mobilized, not a taboo argument, an argument that you hear a lot in public debate. Maybe not in exactly the way that I just characterized it, but in a slightly kind of softer presentation. You hear that a lot in public debate. And the point that the movie is making is that, in fact, Pruitt and Igoe failed not because of the residents, but because of the failures of the planners and the architects and the engineers. And so it was a cocktail of failures on the part of highly credentialed experts. They failed in terms of their planning, in terms of their demographic projections for the population. They failed in terms of the complexity of the buildings themselves. They failed in terms of the way they organized the funding for the maintenance of the buildings. And they probably failed in terms of the political managing the deterioration and the political fallout from that. So it was a cocktail of failures on the part of the government, the architects, the planners, the engineers, the experts, not on the part of the residents. Now, one of the folks in the documentary, you may recall, said something about, well, we knew what we were doing, and there is enough blame to go around. And that's true, right? No matter who you are, no matter what kind of stuff you got going on in your life, taking a piss in the elevator is not a great thing to do, right? Because, you're mad and you want to articulate, you want to express that anger, but that's going to have a negative effect on other people that don't have anything to do with why you're mad, right? Everybody's got to be in the elevator. Nobody wants an elevator that smells like piss, particularly, very stale piss. So we can rightly look at that kind of what we might call deviant behavior that emerges after the breakdown of social organization and say, hey, you got to own that. However, we also have to look at the fact that that behavior emerges after the breakdown of social organization. And the breakdown of social organization is a function of all of these structural and historical phenomena, such as the William Julius Wilson reading, all of that, the spatial inequality, the segregation, as well as the failures of public housing as laid out in Pruitt and Igoe. So I think that's an important lesson to draw from that. Hopefully I have satisfactorily articulated it. So hit me in the comments and tell me why I'm right, why I'm wrong, count how many times I said the word piss in this video, whatever it is that you like. Oh, and one last thing, yes. So we talked previously, our last video was about segregation, about spatial inequality, and so tell me in the comments, let's have a little discussion, a respectful and dignified discussion, not the kind that I lead, about the segregation, about segregation as a theme in the movie. What caused it? What were its causes and what were its consequences? Okay, thank you. See you later.